Texas, 1944. The sun burned over a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the world, blazing across the wire fences and weathered guard towers of Camp Hearn. Dust shimmered in the air, golden, motionless and heavy with heat. Near the corral, a dozen German women stood bareheaded and silent, squinting against the glare. Their hands were rough from long hours stitching uniforms for the very soldiers who had once been their enemies. The air hung thick, the only sound the buzz of flies and the distant whinny of horses. Then, that afternoon, everything changed. The front gate creaked open, and 3 cowboys rode in from the fields, their horses kicking up clouds of red dust. The prisoners froze where they stood. They had heard stories about men like these, the Americans who roped wild cattle faster than they drew breath, who lived free under skies that never ended. One of them, a tall, sunburned ranch hand named Tom Baker, swung down from his saddle and tied his horse to the fence. His eyes swept the line of prisoners until they caught on a young woman standing slightly apart from the rest. Her name was Lucille Bauer, 23, from Munich, a former Luftwaffe clerk captured in Italy. She looked away quickly. Men like him, she had been taught, were monsters. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to vanish. Then Tom did something no one expected. He walked straight toward her, boots crunching in the dust, and stopped a few feet away. He extended his hand. "You ever been on a horse before?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Lucille blinked, certain she'd misheard him. Around them, guards stiffened. Prisoners whispered in German. The camp captain stepped out of his office. Squinting toward the corral, Tom waited. Finally, Lucille shook her head. He smiled, not mockingly, but with quiet kindness, and before anyone could intervene, he stepped forward, lifted her gently by the waist, and set her onto his horse. The world went silent. The women gasped. Even the guards froze. For 10 heartbeats, the camp itself seemed to stop breathing. Lucille sat frozen in the saddle, her hands gripping the horn, her heart hammering. She expected a shout, a blow, punishment, but none came. Tom just said softly, "Hold on tight." "He won't bite." The horse snorted and began a slow circle inside the corral. Dust rose around them like smoke. For the first time in years, Lucille felt movement that wasn't forced, a motion that felt alive. It was freedom disguised as a ride. When the horse stopped, she looked down at Tom. A single tear slipped down her cheek, carving a line through the dust. Tom tipped his hat and said quietly, "You'll be fine, ma'am." Something invisible shifted in that moment, something larger than war or orders. The hatred, the propaganda, the walls between them, all of it cracked. And for the briefest moment, under the burning Texas sun, the impossible happened. Mercy felt stronger than victory. Months before that silent afternoon in Texas, Lucille Bauer had crouched in the dark belly of a German truck rattling through the ruins of northern Italy. The convoy moved only at night, headlights dimmed, engines whispering. Among the women, rumors spread like fever that they were being sent west across the ocean to an American camp. Some called it mercy, others a death sentence. The radio in the driver's cabin still crackled with the Führer's voice, preaching of honor, endurance, and victory. But everyone knew the truth. The cities were dust. Their brothers were dead. The Reich was collapsing, one bomb at a time. Propaganda had promised them glory, posters of proud women beside tanks and flags, but those lies had rotted. In the final months, fear became the only language left. Leaflets warned of Yankee cruelty, that Americans starved their captives, that women prisoners were paraded in shame, that no mercy was given. So when Lucille was captured outside Naples, she expected the end. The American who found her shouted in a language she didn't understand, rifle raised. She froze, trembling, but he looked no older than her brother, and after a moment he lowered his weapon. He handed her a canteen and said a single word she knew. "Drink." It was the first crack in everything she had believed. The journey across the Atlantic took weeks. The ship was crowded. Officers, medics, and women from hospitals and offices. The guards watched closely, but treated them with unexpected civility. They handed out food, bandaged wounds, even shared cigarettes on quiet nights. One dawn, a storm struck, waves pounding the deck like artillery. When the wind tore through the ropes, A sailor wrapped his coat around one of the shivering prisoners. "You'll freeze before we make land," he muttered. Lucille never forgot that moment. It wasn't kindness, she understood. It was confusion. Why would enemies help her live? When the ship finally reached the Gulf of Mexico, land spread out before her like an endless promise. Flat, sunlit, and foreign. The prisoners were herded into trains marked PW and carried north through miles of farmland where children stood waving from fence posts. No hatred, no jeers, just curiosity. At last, the train stopped beside a patch of red earth fenced with barbed wire and cedar posts. A weathered sign read, "Camp Hearn, Texas." Lucille stepped down onto dry ground that smelled of heat and pine. She braced for barking dogs and shouts. Instead, she saw men in cowboy hats tipping them politely. "Welcome to Texas, ladies," one called. The words sounded almost unreal. She whispered to another prisoner, "If this is captivity, it's not the one we were warned about." But inside, fear coiled tighter, because if the enemy wasn't what she expected, then maybe everything else she'd been taught was a lie. By 1944, the United States was running the largest prisoner of war system in history. Nearly 500,000 Axis soldiers, German, Italian, and Japanese, were scattered across more than 500 camps throughout the American heartland. And in one of them, beneath a sun that showed no mercy, a story began that would defy every rule of war. By 1944, the United States held nearly 500,000 Axis prisoners of war. Texas alone housed more than 70,000. The endless plains, open skies, and vast ranchlands made escape nearly impossible. Yet these camps were unlike any prisons the world had seen. Built quickly but with military precision, they reflected not cruelty, but efficiency. The War Department had issued clear orders. The Geneva Convention would be followed to the letter. Every prisoner would be housed, fed, and treated according to rank. Officers had separate quarters. Medical care was mandatory. Abuse was forbidden. It wasn't compassion that shaped American policy, it was calculation. A content prisoner caused fewer problems, required fewer guards, and saved resources. But in practice, this cold logic produced something far more profound. Camp Hearn, deep in the heart of Texas, became a paradox, part fortress, part frontier town. Whitewashed barracks lined the perimeter in neat rows, their wooden walls gleaming beneath the punishing sun. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the kitchens each morning, mingling with the dry sweetness of hay and saddle leather from the nearby stables. Prisoners grew vegetables, painted murals, even staged plays in makeshift theaters. They earned small wages for their labor, exchangeable at the camp canteen for cigarettes, postcards, or bottles of Coca-Cola. To the women arriving from the broken ruins of Europe, it looked unreal. There were no iron walls, no shouting guards, no snarling dogs, only wooden fences, wide skies, and American soldiers who said please and thank you. Some were assigned to sewing units, mending uniforms for men who might one day face their brothers. Others worked the fields, planting crops that would feed both sides of the war effort. The camp's commander, Major William R. Walker, believed that discipline could coexist with dignity. "If we treat them like beasts," he told his officers, "we'll make them beasts. But if we treat them like humans, they'll remember it." His philosophy spread quickly through the ranks of guards, many of whom were young Texans drafted from local ranches. They still wore their sun-faded work clothes beneath government-issue helmets and carried themselves with a kind of plain-spoken fairness that had more to do with upbringing than ideology. The result was a strange, almost impossible balance. A prisoner of war camp that felt more like a small town at the edge of the world. There were fences, yes, but they stood in fields so wide the horizon seemed to swallow fear. When the prisoners first saw guards on horseback, their whispers carried through the barracks like wind through grass. "So this is America," wrote Liselotte Bauer in her diary that night. "We were ready to meet monsters. Instead, we met men who laugh in the sun. None of them realized it yet, but that fragile blend of order and openness would do more to dissolve Nazism in their hearts than any Allied bomb ever could." The first week passed in silence. The German women worked, ate, and slept with mechanical precision. still half convinced that this civility was some elaborate trick. The guards, mostly farmhands turned soldiers, found the quiet unsettling. Texans weren't built for silence. They filled their days with talk, laughter, and the rhythm of work. But the prisoners watched them closely, measuring, cautious, unsure. Then one afternoon something changed. Tom Baker, a 25-year-old rancher from Llano County, was helping repair a fence near the women's barracks when he noticed one of them sitting apart from the rest. Drawing on the back of a torn cardboard box, it was Liselot. She was hunched over, lost in concentration, a stub of pencil in her fingers. On the cardboard was the outline of a horse in motion, muscles taut, mane flying, captured with startling precision. Tom whistled softly. "You draw real good, miss." Startled, she looked up. No American had spoken to her directly since arrival. "Danke," she whispered, uncertain if she'd broken a rule. He smiled. "Means thank you, right?" She nodded. Tom crouched beside her, tracing the air as if sketching the same horse. "You ever seen one run for real, out in the open?" Liselot shook her head. "Only soldiers' horses. Never free ones." Tom pointed toward the open pasture beyond the barbed wire. "We run ours out there after supper. You should watch sometime. They don't know they're the lucky ones." He tipped his hat and walked away. That brief exchange rippled through the barracks that night like a forbidden secret. "He spoke to you?" one woman asked in disbelief. "And you answered?" "Yes," Liselotte whispered, and he smiled. For the guards, curiosity became mutual. The enemy they'd imagined, the sneering Nazis from newsreels, weren't here. Instead, they saw frightened young women who flinched at raised voices and worked hard without complaint. The camp chaplain noted in his report, "They seem astonished by decency, as though kindness is a language they're only beginning to learn." Gradually, the invisible wall began to crumble. Guards tipped their hats when passing work details. The women began returning the gesture, awkwardly at first, then naturally. A few guards left small tokens, an apple, a folded newspaper. The women responded with hand-sewn handkerchiefs, pencil sketches, or simple nods of gratitude. And when the ranch guards rode their horses past the camp fence in the evenings, the women gathered to watch, smiling for the first time in months. That night, Liselot wrote in her diary, "They ride like they were born on the wind, and yet they smile at us, the defeated, as if we are still worth smiling at." None of them knew it yet, but that fragile exchange of humanity, the quiet decision to see the enemy as someone worth knowing, would lead to a moment when one cowboy's act of forbidden compassion would change everything. By midsummer, the heat over Camp Hearn shimmered like glass. Work began before sunrise to outrun the blaze. The German women spent their mornings stitching canvas, washing uniforms, or tending vegetable plots fenced in near the stables. But on Sundays, the camp loosened its rhythm. Guards played cards beneath the sparse shade. Horses were brushed and walked. The cowboys, those born riders in uniform, sometimes staged small contests just to break the monotony. It was on one such Sunday that everything changed. Behind the stables, the men had set up a makeshift rodeo. A dozen soldiers and prisoners gathered along the fence to watch. The air smelled of sweat and dust. The horses pranced nervously, snorting under the sun. Tom Baker was among the riders, his Stetson tilted low, sunlight glinting off his belt buckle. From behind the wire, Liselot and a few other women watched, their hands clutching the fence posts, eyes wide. When Tom's turn came, he mounted a bay gelding named Whiskey, a horse with a reputation for having more will than sense. The animal pawed the ground, muscles trembling. "Let's go, boy," Tom muttered, and the gate swung open. Whiskey bolted like a shot. Dust exploded beneath his hooves, and Tom clung to the saddle, legs braced, jaw tight. The men cheered and hollered as the cowboy fought for balance. After a tense minute, he brought the horse to a stop, breathless and grinning, dust rising around him like smoke. Someone in the crowd shouted, half joking, "Let the German ladies have a turn!" Laughter rippled through the camp, but the guards nearby froze. The suggestion was absurd and dangerous. Tom turned, scanning the fence line. His eyes found Liselot standing still, sketchbook clutched in one hand. She had been drawing him again, the same sure lines that had caught a horse mid-gallop weeks before. He smiled and walked toward her, reins loose in his hand. "Miss Bower," he called, surprising her by name. "Ever been in a saddle?" The women around her gasped. Liselotte shook her head quickly. "Nein." "Never." Tom hesitated, his smile softening. "Would you like to?" The camp went silent. Even the cicadas seemed to hush. The captain overseeing the event frowned, his fingers tightening around his clipboard. Regulations forbade unnecessary contact between guards and prisoners. But the air held something larger than rules: curiosity, laughter, and the restless kindness that sometimes slips past caution. Tom made his choice. He walked to the fence, opened the small gate, and extended his hand. "Come on," he said. "He don't bite." Liselotte stepped forward as if in a dream. The crowd fell silent, the sound of her footsteps loud against the dirt. Even the horse stilled, ears twitching, sensing the change. Tom took her hand gently. Without strain, he lifted her up into the saddle. For a moment, the camp stopped breathing. She sat awkwardly, gripping the saddle horn, eyes wide. Tom steadied the reins and said softly, "Just breathe. You're safe." He led Whiskey in a slow circle around the corral. The leather creaked. The hooves drummed a steady rhythm. The air shimmered. Liselotte's fear melted into wonder. For the first time since her capture, she felt something break loose inside her. A memory of movement, of wind, of being alive. When they stopped, Tom looked up and grinned. "See? Told you he was gentle." She tried to answer, but her voice failed her. Tears rolled down her cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dust. He helped her down. Her knees trembled as her boots met the ground. No one spoke. Later in her diary she wrote, "The moment he lifted me, I stopped being a prisoner. For 10 seconds, I remembered I was human." From that day forward, everything in Camp Hearn changed. Though no one dared to say it aloud, the silence that followed lingered long after she stepped away from the fence. Even the cicadas, loud and relentless all summer, seemed to pause. A German prisoner, enemy of the United States, had sat astride an American horse. Lifted there by a cowboy in uniform, Major Walker had seen it all. For a long moment, he said nothing. The guards waited for the storm. Instead, the Major exhaled, adjusted his cap, and muttered, "Well, hell," so long as she didn't fall. Then he walked away. The camp stayed frozen, as though even breathing too loudly might break the fragile spell that had just been cast. Liselotte stood by the fence, hands trembling, the warmth of the horse still lingering in her palms. Across the yard, Tom tipped his hat. "Didn't mean no harm, ma'am," he said softly. "Just thought you might like to know how freedom feels." She nodded, unable to speak. That night, the story spread through Camp Hearn faster than wildfire on dry grass. Some whispered it was propaganda. Others said the cowboy would be court-martialed. But the next morning, Tom Baker was still there, drinking coffee, same as always. The guards weren't angry. If anything, they looked changed, and the women, they stood a little straighter. Their eyes met those of their captors without flinching. The air of weary defeat that had clung to them since capture had begun to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar: dignity. The simple act of being lifted onto that horse had done what no speech, sermon, or policy ever could. It had restored their sense of humanity. Liselotte, once withdrawn and hollow-eyed, became the bridge between two worlds. She began teaching the guards simple German phrases, sketching portraits of their horses, even translating old songs. When she laughed, the sound startled everyone, like something long buried finding its way back to daylight. Tom Baker never spoke much about that day. To him, it hadn't been rebellion or romance, just instinct. "Ain't right keeping folks scared of sunlight," he said once, when someone asked. But deep down, he knew something sacred had passed between them, something words couldn't hold. The camp chaplain, who visited every Sunday with dust on his boots and scripture in his hand, wrote in his journal that week. A cowboy lifted an enemy onto his horse, and for a heartbeat, the war stopped. No sermon I could preach would reach the soul like that. When Major Walker eventually filed his report to headquarters, he made no mention of the incident. His summary was brief and bureaucratic, morale improving steadily among female prisoners. No disciplinary issues, but word slipped past the fences anyway. Guards told their families back home. Ranchers repeated it over dinner tables and small-town cafes. "You hear about that cowboy who put a German woman on his horse?" they'd ask, shaking their heads, half smiling. In a world drowning in destruction, that single sliver of grace felt like defiance. Years later, when historians interviewed the former prisoners of Camp Hearn, nearly all of them remembered that moment. Some couldn't recall the cowboy's name, some swore the horse was white instead of bay, but all agreed on one thing. The instant he lifted her, the camp seemed to hold its breath. And when it exhaled, the war felt a little smaller. That night, Liselotte wrote in her diary, "He gave me 10 feet of freedom, and it was enough to last a lifetime." By the end of that week, Camp Hearn no longer felt the same. Something unseen had shifted, spreading quietly from one heart to another. The guards were still guards, the prisoners still prisoners. But the sharp edge between them had dulled. The women began to hum as they worked. Faint German folk songs floated through the Texas wind, weaving between the clang of hammers and the whinny of horses. Sometimes the guards joined in with their own tunes. Old cowboy ballads, slow and easy. 2 melodies, 2 languages, blending into something that belonged to neither and both. Liselotte became the center of it all, without ever meaning to. Her sketch of the moment, Tom lifting her onto Whiskey's back, was passed from hand to hand. First among the women, then among the guards. Someone tacked it to the mess hall wall. Beneath it, another hand scrawled in pencil, "Not all fences keep people apart. When the chaplain saw it, he left it there." He would later say, "Some sermons are better drawn than spoken, but not everyone approved." One cold morning, an officer from headquarters arrived unannounced. He'd heard whispers, rumors of fraternization, of discipline gone soft. The camp stiffened as he walked through the gates, boots crunching over gravel, eyes sharp as rifle barrels. He inspected every barrack, every fence post, every ledger. At lunch, he sat across from Major Walker. Neither man spoke until the officer finally said, "Is it true one of your men put a German woman on a horse?" Walker didn't blink. "Yes, sir. And you didn't discipline him?" Walker set down his fork. "No, sir. Didn't see the need. No harm done." The officer frowned. "You understand how that looks?" Walker leaned back in his chair, his voice calm. "I do, sir. But I also understand how it feels. The men sleep easier. The women work better. No fights, no hate. You want me to punish the one act that made this place human again?" The officer stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once and finished his meal. He left at dawn without filing a single report. No one ever spoke of it again in official channels, but everyone remembered. It became camp lore, a story traded in whispers during late-night watches, murmured prayers and long train rides home. For the prisoners, it was proof that mercy still existed. For the cowboys, proof that decency didn't need permission. Liselotte's health improved. Her cheeks filled with color. Sometimes she'd stand by the fence at sunset, watching the horses run across the red-dusted prairie. The light caught her hair, turning it gold. Tom would wave from the stables. She'd wave back. A gesture so small it might have been missed by anyone not looking for it. But it carried the weight of something wordless and vast. In her censored letters home, she wrote of strange kindness. They treat us not as enemies, but as people who have lost our way. The German censors let it pass, not realizing the quiet revolution those words carried. In the camp's records, 1944 went down as an uneventful year. No riots, no escapes, no disciplinary actions. But for those who lived it, 1944 was remembered for something else entirely, the year the fences didn't feel so high. Years later, a surviving guard told a local reporter that cowboy didn't break a rule. He broke the war for a minute, and maybe that's all anyone ever really needed. Winter came late to Texas that year, soft and dry, the prairie frosted gold at sunrise. Camp Hearn grew quiet with the cold. There was less work, fewer visitors, and more time for thoughts that had nowhere to go. For the German women, homesickness sharpened like a blade. For the guards, the war began to feel far away, fading into the horizon like a storm that had already passed. By winter, Camp Hearn had settled into a hush. The air turned sharp in the mornings, the prairie dusted white with frost. Even the horses seemed quieter, their breath rising in pale clouds. Liselotte spent her evenings in the recreation hall, writing beneath a dim bulb that hummed softly overhead. Her letters were written in German, the words careful, almost musical. The censors would read every line, but she no longer wrote to escape. She wrote to remember. "Dearest Mutter," she began one night, "today the cowboy let me feed the horses." Their breath came out in clouds. They thought of our farm, of Vater in the fields. "The Americans call this land God's country, and I believe it. It is too large to hate anyone for long." The guards learned to leave her be when she wrote. Some even brought her extra paper. Private Jenkins, a farm boy from Oklahoma, once asked what she wrote about. She smiled faintly. "Freedom," she said, but in small words. The story of Camp Hearn's gentleness began to drift beyond the fences. Red Cross visitors sent back glowing reports. Newspapers quietly printed photographs of German women smiling beside American guards. A war-weary nation, desperate for something decent to believe in, clung to those images. Acts of kindness sold better than stories of ruin. Liselotte's diary from that time glows with details. Cattle drives passing near the camp, cowboys tipping their hats as they rode by, the sound of harmonicas beneath the stars. "The music sounds like longing," she wrote, "but perhaps all longing sounds like America." Her bond with Tom Baker remained mostly wordless. They spoke little, rules were still rules, but their silences carried meaning. Once he left an apple on the fence post near her workbench. The next day, she returned it polished, a small horse carved into its skin. Neither mentioned it again. The camp chaplain noticed the change. During Sunday service, he said, "There's holiness in small mercies. Wars end faster when people remember each other's faces." By early 1945, it was clear the war was nearing its end. Newspapers arrived with headlines of Allied victories. Some prisoners wept quietly at night. Others stared at the ceiling, afraid to imagine what surrender would mean. For Liselotte, the thought of going home stirred confusion more than relief. Captivity, strange as it was, had awakened something Germany had buried. One morning, as she mended horsetack, she asked softly, "When this ends, do you think we'll remember each other?" Tom hesitated. "If I forget," he said, "I don't reckon I deserve the memory." She smiled. "When I go home, I will tell them Americans did not win with hate. They won with hands that built instead of destroyed." That night the radio crackled with news. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. The war was collapsing. Outside, the horses shifted restlessly under a sky full of strange, bright stars. On the morning of May 8, 1945, stillness swept through the camp. No shouted orders, no hammers ringing in the workshop, only the hiss of the radio inside the mess hall. The German women stood clustered around it, the guards behind them. The voice on the broadcast was calm, almost tender. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces." The words fell like stones into the Texas dust. Liselotte's hands trembled. Some women gasped. Others sank to their knees, overcome by years of fear and exhaustion. Tom removed his hat and bowed his head. Major Walker, standing beside him, whispered, "It's over." For the first time in years, no one in Camp Hearn felt like an enemy. The fences no longer mattered. The women didn't know whether to weep or celebrate. Home was rubble, families scattered, but they were alive. And survival, beneath that wide Texas sky, felt like its own kind of victory. Later that morning, the guards brought food, extra rations, real coffee, and, to everyone's surprise, bottles of Coca-Cola chilled in buckets of melting ice. Someone played Glenn Miller's "In the Mood." The melody drifted over the camp, and laughter rose freely for the first time since captivity began. Liselotte sat quietly, holding the bottle in both hands, watching the sunlight spark in the glass. It was absurd, she thought, to taste sweetness on the same day her country had died. And yet somehow it felt right. Tom walked over, offered a plate of bacon and biscuits, and said softly, "Breakfast, Ma'am." She looked up, eyes shining. "For peace?" He smiled. "For peace." She took a bite, tears gathering. It wasn't just food. It was everything the war had tried to erase. Warmth, kindness, humanity. Around them, a few women began to hum a German lullaby. One of the guards joined in with the tune. Soon, the camp was alive with a strange harmony. Two nations that had once tried to destroy each other, now singing beneath the same sky. When the meal ended, Major Walker raised his cup and said quietly, "No prisoners here today, just people." That night, Liselotte wrote in her diary, "We drank their Coca-Cola and cried into their coffee. We thought defeat would taste like humiliation, but instead, it tasted like forgiveness." As the sun sank behind the mesquite trees, Tom walked the perimeter one last time before lights out. He found her standing by the fence, watching the horizon glow red and gold. "Guess you'll be heading home soon," he said. "Yes," she replied softly. "But part of me will stay here." He nodded, understanding without words. Then after a pause, he reached up and handed her something, his old cowboy hat, sweat-stained and frayed at the brim. "Keep it," he said. "So you don't forget Texas." She pressed it to her chest. "I will never forget," she said. "Not Texas, not you." In the official reports filed later, May 8th was simply marked VE Day, no incidents reported. But for those who lived it, it was something far greater, the day enemies became human again. 2 months later, Camp Hearn began to empty. One by one, the trucks rolled out through the gates, carrying the German women toward the coast and the waiting ships home. Each departure was quiet, no bands, no speeches, only the creak of wheels and the weight of farewells too deep for words. Liselotte stood beside the truck, clutching a small suitcase and the worn hat Tom had given her. Around her, other women carried small mementos, sketches, carvings, a few wooden horses from the camp workshop. The guards lined up to see them off. For months they had been watchmen. Now they looked like friends. When her turn came, Liselotte stepped forward and found Tom waiting by the gate. He looked awkward in his clean uniform, his hat gone. "Guess this is goodbye," he said. "For now," she replied with a faint smile. "You taught me how to ride again, not just the horse, but life." Tom chuckled. Never figured a cowboy'd end up teaching a German how to live. She reached out, took his hand, just long enough to feel its warmth, then climbed into the truck. As it rumbled away, Tom lifted his arm in one last wave. She waved back until the camp vanished in the dust. Back in Germany, Liselotte returned to ruins. Her town was unrecognizable. Factories flattened, homes burned, her family scattered. Yet she carried Texas with her, the open skies, the laughter, the kindness of those who had treated her not as a prisoner, but as a person. She began volunteering in the reconstruction efforts, teaching children English, telling stories of the strange mercy she had found behind barbed wire. When asked why she spoke kindly of her captors, she answered simply, "Because they were never my captors. They were my teachers." Her diary from those years, now preserved in a museum in Bremen, contains an entry dated July 1945. "They beat us with no whips, conquered us without chains. They showed us strength without cruelty. I saw America not through its bombs, but through a cowboy's eyes. And what I saw was freedom." In Texas, Camp Hearn was dismantled by the end of 1946. The barracks were sold for lumber. The fences rusted away. Only the old horse corral remained, its posts bleached by the sun. Tom Baker returned to ranch life, married, raised a family. Yet sometimes, when someone mentioned the war, he'd glance east and say quietly, "I once met a German woman who rode better than most cowboys." Years passed. Then, in 1962, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed simply to Mr. Tom Baker, Texas, United States. Inside was a photograph. A woman standing before a rebuilt farmhouse, wearing a sun hat with a familiar curve to its brim. On the back, written in careful English, were 4 words, "Still riding, still free." Tom never replied. He didn't need to. When he passed away years later, his grandson found that same photo framed above his desk. Beneath it, in Tom's rough handwriting, were the words, "The day we stopped being enemies, the war ended." But the memory endured, not of bombs or battlefields, but of a quiet morning in Texas, when a cowboy lifted a woman onto a horse, and the world, for a fleeting moment, remembered its humanity. Because sometimes the greatest victories do not thunder with cannons. They whisper through compassion. And in that whisper, history found its redemption.